You are listening to Bootstrap Farmer Radio.
Hey, good morning, everybody. So last week I was on vacation and Brandon was able to take my spot as the interviewer and sit down with Chris Thoreau of Vancouver Urban Micro. Chris is a long-term food grower and urban food innovator in Vancouver, and he specializes in low-capital microgreen production systems. And I really like that systems part because he really looks at everything involved that is needed not only to grow, but to sell and to maintain a great business. He's an owner member of the Vancouver Food Peddlers Co-op. It's a part of a local food chain with other farmers, restaurants, and markets, and I'm sure that could be a huge podcast just in itself, and hopefully we can get back to that at some point. He is set in on the Urban Food Policy Council as the urban farming liaison, which helps start a dialogue with policy gaps and working with the city and giving farmers a voice. And that's really nice to see other leaders stepping up and being a part of the conversation that bridges the gap between policymakers and farmers, and something that's much needed. So my hat's off to that. He has a series of video workshops, consults, a very nice detailed microgreen crop planner. He is available for site visits and has a series of free videos and images. So if you want to take a look at growing microgreens at a production scale, get some good visuals, this is a great site to go to. If microgreens is something you're looking to get into, you might want to invest in yourself, get that crop planner. We don't make any affiliate money, and in fact we have a blanket policy where we will not accept any affiliate money. This is just something we believe in. Chris has done an amazing job putting all this together. It's a great website, Vancouver Urban Micro. Just take a look at it. If it's something that you feel you really want to go into, it's worth the time investment to get a little bit of insider knowledge. And he also runs a blog, both academic and for sunflowers. Sunflower shoots is one of his main crops. In this interview, just like everything else, we really don't talk about the actual growing of things, but we talk about everything that goes into starting, running a business, scaling it up, and the ins and outs of just being a business owner. It was a great interview. Thank you very much to Brandon for taking care of this on vacation and letting me get away with the family for a little bit. And with that, I'm going to leave you to it, and we're going to just hop right in.
All right, so we are here with Chris Thoreau of the Food Peddlers Co-op. He's a founding member there. Also Vancouver Urban Micro and Farm Folk City Folk. So thanks for coming on, Chris. Did I get that intro right?
That sounds pretty good, yeah.
Cool. So just give people 1 or 2 minute background of who you are. You're definitely on other podcasts out there, which I'm going to recommend because you have a lot of good information when it comes to microgreens. But just give people a sense of who you are and how you kind of got there.
Yeah, who I am and how I got there, that's a very good question. I ask myself that all the time.
Green business owner's perspective, how about that?
Yeah, so so before I did microgreens, I did run a small certified organics farm that did mixed vegetables for restaurants and farmers markets and CSAs. So I came into microgreens in an urban environment after farming in a rural environment. Fairly small scale, but I had left farming to go back to school and wanted to find a way to still get my hands in the dirt, but while being in an urban environment. And a lot of the urban farming models are based on using people's residential space and converting their lawns into gardens. And it's an interesting model, but it's not for me. Working with that many different people in that many different locations just it doesn't work for me. And so I knew from my farming days that microgreens was a way to get, the best return per square foot. Mm-hmm. And so having, going back to school and wanting to continue growing, I knew microgreens would be the way to do that. And so basically just started on the steps towards making that a small business.
So it was sort of a mix of lifestyle design meets market opportunity meets your own personal interest?
Yeah, for me, like on a personal level, agriculture, when I got into farming, which was in my mid-20s, was very therapeutic. And so it really helped me through some personal stuff. And so I was really drawn to it. And so the idea of leaving the farm and going back to the city and risking losing that wasn't a chance I wanted to take. So I did really want to have agriculture as part of my life still. I pretty much made a decision that would be my career path. I knew microgreens was the only way to get that kind of return in the city. And at the time, I didn't know if it could be done or what it would look like, but I knew just on paper that was the thing that would do it.
Yeah. And so why did you pick microgreens, and what was your approach? And then just to add on to that, because I know that approach is always evolving. You came into microgreens in a new market where there was probably not many other vendors selling microgreens. So just kind of knowing that, how would you maybe get into the market now, knowing that you might have to differentiate yourself a little more?
Yeah, I do have to take some time to reflect back on how things are now and how things were I'll actually go back to 2006, because that's when I first started thinking about the idea of growing microgreens. And that was on my radar because even earlier than that, I had been sprouting in my kitchen and doing things as I was getting more along this path of what does self-sufficiency look like. And you know how the mid-20s are. You're exploring yourself and trying to find some identity and all that stuff. Yeah. We're not going to get into that today. Sprouts and microgreens were always just this little thread that followed me along. And I did do them because I know that there was when I was on Vancouver Island here in British Columbia and market gardening, I noticed very clearly nobody was doing sprouts, nobody was doing microgreens at the market. And in talking to people, one of the things that really turned them off was the regulatory aspect. There's much more hygiene and sanitation that goes around it. It's a repetitive process. You've got to be on top of it all the time. And people were really turned off and intimidated by that. And I just read the regulations, read the guidelines and realized it could be done. What happened is I just started to build a relationship with this type of product because it was niche, and I kind of like to find that niche, whether it's in food or other things. So that's what started it. Yeah, obviously one of the challenges was back then, you couldn't just Google how to grow microgreens and have the shit ton of information that you've got now. There's so much stuff out there, but I knew intuitively that it was and I say this word gently, it was too amateur. I could tell even without growing microgreens, because of my farming experience, there was lots of things people were missing. There were a lot of inefficiencies. And so I knew as it developed, I thought, well, microgreens, because it's such a high value crop, you get such a high return for the space, and you're getting these repetitive crops. So you're growing a lot all the time, that it would work particularly well for the urban environment. The other thing is it wouldn't need a lot of infrastructure, and the infrastructure that I started with could easily be moved. And in an urban environment, that's key, because it's hard to have tenure in a city like Vancouver. You're more likely to get moved around. A big part of it was, the value per unit space, but complementary to that is, there's value in coffee and alcohol and all these other products. I like microgreens as a nutritional product, as something you could grow that would nourish you, much more so along that path then than I am now or in my later years, because that stuff just becomes automatic. I'm growing a fresh organic product. I know the nutritional value of it. That stuff I didn't have to highlight and focus on so much. What I needed to focus on was how to be efficient in order to make it profitable and how to run an operation. Growing microgreens is easy, but growing microgreens and doing all these other things associated with the business is quite a challenge. Yeah. So that's where I needed to focus. Yeah. So microgreens is an interesting crop for that, as I said, because you're growing it, every 8 days you're growing a new crop. So you learn very quickly. And so I knew going into it that I'd be able to develop a system fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm. And you felt like practice, even though, let's say you did have a guide, and you do have a guide, really. You created this microgreen crop planner, which is really awesome. I went through it. I bought the $75. That's how we kind of connected. I just found that out. And, my guys here, they're starting to grow a lot more microgreens. And they felt a little uncomfortable with planning it all out, all the costs involved. And I Googled just like anyone else when we came across your planner. And that really gave them a lot of comfort, because they just want to know that, yes, they are considering everything. And at the same time, to have that comfort level, just knowing that they feel a little bit better about it, it reduces the overall stress of trying to launch, a young business. And so while they're figuring that out, they're practicing at the same time, because while there might be some shortcuts or some help with the crop planner, there's really no shortcuts to growing and getting that feel for growing microgreens, right?
No, there's not. And even as it is with anything, even if you have guidance and good consulting and good training, you actually still need to go and do the stuff yourself. And I know a lot of the value, like the feedback I get from people is the value they get from our consults are just, it's that little stuff. Like you can watch the training videos and be like, yeah, okay, I get it. Like growing microgreens is easy. But it's the little things. It's the knowing how to make adjustments. It's knowing how to balance crop planning and accounting and marketing and all the different aspects of the business that gets really, really tricky. And what that involves for a lot of people is a transition in your mindset from being an employee to an owner. Because we spend most of our lives as an employee and we're told what to do or we learn what to do and we do those tasks. And, occasionally if they don't get done, someone else will do them. There's all these things about being an owner that are different than being an employee. And it's empowering in that sense, but it comes with a higher level of responsibility as well.
And you can't just flip that switch because what you're asking yourself to do is create 1,000 new little habits. And just because you watch a course doesn't mean you're going to go home and be able to flip the switch on all those 1,000 little habits. It's making a schedule, waking up, doing the same thing every time, every week. Those checks and balances when you're working for somebody aren't there anymore. It's up to you.
You need to set them yourself, and your motivator should be in essence, your bottom line, not to be too focused on profit. But in general, if you've got a model that works, the harder you work at it, likely the more revenue you're going to generate. Yeah. And the trick there is doing it efficiently so your revenue is more than your expenses and you have a profit. So that's key.
So I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on this, but how did you sort of plan out, okay, I need to make this much money? Did you start it from not just sales revenue, but what you need to make to have a living for yourself? Did you think about that beforehand, or you just kind of dive in and said you're going to make it work later? And then when you answer that, maybe how you would maybe reapproach that.
Well, I think you can take either approach. You can either just grow stuff and figure it out and figure out how the finances work, or you can plan it all out in a spreadsheet and have a good sense of that and adjust as you go. I did the former. I was more into growing then. I wanted to do the growing. I had developed my first crop planner fairly quickly and did do a business plan, but I didn't know the numbers as well as I know them now. I didn't have that skill set. I didn't really have the patience for it at the time, but I also, in the bigger context of, once again, what was happening in my life, when I started the business, I had just moved from one city to another. I was going back to school, so I was in school full time in a new city. This Microgreens was actually a directed studies project through my degree. Basically the winter before I started the business and was in development, I had a son. So there's all these things that, there's all these things you want to do in an ideal world, but I just couldn't do them all. There wasn't enough time. So for me, it was I had an intuitive sense from my farming experience that I could make it work, and I was happy to go with that. And I knew to sort of keep track of things as I was going, so I recorded things really well and documented things well. I knew what I generated in revenue, and I knew what my expenses were in that first year, and had a lot of working out to do. When I think back, my price was about $10 a pound, I think, at the time, which was very underpriced. And there were lessons there, but I also at the same time gained a good following, a good reputation, and putting that price up over time meant that actually those people stayed with me because they all along still saw good value for their money. Yeah. So a lot of people will say, like, you can't build a house without a plan and you can't do this without that. And yeah, I wouldn't build a house without a plan, but I'd start a small microgreens business without a plan and develop as I go. I spent in that first year $10,000. And it's not a lot of money. And, if it went under, I'd lose that money, but I'd have that experience. So it was a risk worth taking. I wasn't starting a car company,
And it's almost an approach you have to take a lot of times in business, especially kind of a new starting from nothing business, because you can't really plan out 2 years ahead of time. You don't know where you're going to be, what you're going to be doing, what your market is actually going to demand. When I started Bootstrap Farmer, all I did was ask a simple question: is how do we make seed trays stronger? I didn't really think about anything else, and I just sent an email, and I didn't really do the numbers really at the beginning, and you just kind of go and it builds. And because I didn't have a vision 5 years ahead of time, I allowed myself to pivot based off of what the market was saying, what felt right to me, my lifestyle. And I think that small pivot is really helpful for anybody not being too fixated.
Well, there's a few things to consider here. And one of the most important things, I think, is the age at which you enter your venture. I started the microgreens business when I was 33, I think, or 34. That was a bit late in the game, but I still had energy. And I was like, you know what, I can just do this. I've got energy. I've got time. I didn't have time, but I had the energy. I had a bit of time. I could make it happen. And so it was a risk I could take. If I was in my mid-20s, I would just say, like, just figure it out and do it. You have nothing to lose. Now, though, if I was to do it at this age, and I do a lot of consults with people my age or a little older that are sick of their careers, they want to make a change. At this point, I would be doing the numbers very carefully. And I'm actually, through my work with Farm Folk City Folk, we're developing these models for organic vegetable seed production. One of the advantages of doing the numbers is you can share the numbers with others, so you can give people a sense of what things are like, what it looks like, what your expenses are, where the money is. When you're young, you're driven by your values and you're driven by a vision. As you get older, it's great you have the values and vision, but I need to see some numbers to complement that. I can't take the same risks now that I could then. So those are important contexts to keep in mind.
That's really good advice, and I find that to be very true. When I was in an office working the 9 to 5 up in Delaware, and when I moved down here to North Carolina, I had all the energy in the world. I was out in the summer sun, running back and forth, building the greenhouse, sweating my ass off, and it was nothing to me. I'd do it the next day, and I couldn't wait to do it the next day.
Yeah.
2 years later, my knees hurt. I could still feel it in my knees. Now that I'm 30, even though I don't have anything tying me down and I can still make business decisions sort of on the fly, I'm not building a greenhouse by myself anymore. I'm not, there's certain things I just won't do.
Yeah, I think there's the idea of shifting from working harder to working smarter. I think at certain points you need to do both. When I think about when we did our greenhouse conversion and built the shipping container greenhouse here, it was just go, work. Tried to do a combination of working harder and working smarter. But in the beginning, it was just like work and figure it out, go till midnight, get up at 5 o'clock, do it the next day. That's not happening anymore, I can tell you that.
Yeah. You don't know what you don't know, really, and you don't know that you should be asking better questions to yourself.
Well, that's a consequence of youth, that thing, and it's now I'm being this slightly older person talking back to my younger self. There's a lot of, if I was to go into anything else, there'd be lots of things that I don't know, but I know how to figure those things out because of my experience. And so that phrase, while it has some value, it's like, I don't know what I don't know, but I know that there's things that I don't know, and I'm going to find that stuff out. So what it is, it's kind of like an analogy I've used is painting a room. You spend all this time, you spend way more time prepping the room and planning and filling holes in that than you do painting. Painting is just like, boom, it's done. And so it's the same thing. I think because we're very, I think it's a challenge of a multiple generations of wanting fairly instant gratification, wanting things to be done, wanting the success and the recognition that comes with it. But literally, it's just like plan, research, think, trial, do this, do that. It's just like, this is so tedious. But when you launch, boom, you're gone. And you're still working hard, but you're already anticipating problems. They're problems you didn't know you were going to have, but you knew the type of problems you were going to have. So the idea of not knowing what you don't know, it only goes so far, and you need to learn to change your thinking, I think, to prepare for the unknown.
It's your mental approach towards problem solving. When
Yes.
you have a boss, you could always go ask the question because he knows the answer if you get stuck. But when you're in business for yourself, the answer is not even clear. There's no right answer most of the time. And so if you can solve a problem the long, hard way, that's because what you do at the beginning, and then through experience, you sort of learn to do it in a much more efficient way.
Well, we need to get away from the idea that we need to have an expert as our mentor. A lot of things that I figured out were because I would just talk to friends, either who were in agriculture, so they understood systems and similar things, or just general friends like, hey, like, hey, I'm stressed out about this, and I'd mention something, and they just say the most off the cuff thing, and I would be like, oh, you're totally right, like problem solved. And one of the things that happens is we look at things in a very narrow scope. We get caught up in our work. And that's one of the challenges of that sort of working hard concept is you just get caught up in the work and in the tasks and in the doing, and you kind of forget about the being that you're trying to achieve. I think you've got to zoom in and you've got to zoom back out. You've got to zoom in and you've got to zoom back out. And having mentors and people you can work with that aren't within your field is a big advantage. And I look at that in a lot of the stuff I do. I love talking to non-seed people about how to plant seed crops. I love talking to people who know nothing about agriculture when I talk about being more efficient, because they bring a perspective that isn't caught up in the in the culture that comes with that. And there's very definitely now a culture of microgreens. You see it in the listservs, the Facebook pages, podcasts like this and whatnot, and it's great. But we're all starting to get stuck in an idea of what microgreens are. And every once in a while, things need to be sort of, tossed around. And this is where that outside perspective really is valuable. One of the things that's nice is there's a lot of new entrants. And so they're often bringing new ideas, new perspectives, because they're coming from IT or the restaurant industry or wherever. And so they bring the skills that they had and they bring new perspectives. So it allows the sector to develop very quickly.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. I agree with that. Now, you mentioned a lot of people are coming from other industries, technology, finance. I came from a finance background, and they might have some outside the box ideas. Are there any new uses of microgreens, people doing something creative, bringing microgreens to market in a
That's a good question. So it's rare that I see something and I go, oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the innovations, we can talk a little bit about what we mean by innovation within this, but one of the things I see is people really are technology driven, they're product driven. So they're trying to find these new technological ways of growing microgreens. I made a decision myself to not go down that path. Like my model is tray, soil, seeds, sunlight. And I do that for a very specific reason, because I'm looking at my microgreens as a business that is more than about generating the revenue. There's a bigger picture to it. And there's still lots of problems with any business model in terms of its impact, but that's something to keep in mind. So I think there's good stuff coming out, but it's going along a path that I wouldn't take because it is getting a lot more technologically driven.
Yeah.
I think probably where we're going to see the best innovations is the stuff we're not going to see. It's the little things people do that make the microgreens business fit their life, right? And just little clever things. And there's little bits that I hear once in a while. I'm like, oh, that's a good idea. Like, oh, that would be, that makes sense. But they're not that necessarily the big things about how to do seeding and how to fill a tray with soil. That stuff is generally going to be fairly consistent. Yeah. So I think it's more about how people run their operation, how they integrate it into their lives. That's the stuff that I think is happening. It's what I get a sense of more, but that's hard stuff to see unless you're actually involved in the operation.
Yeah. I guess where I'm looking for innovation sometimes is how we're making the consumer understand the benefit of microgreens. I feel like no one really knows what it is yet, and farmers feel uncomfortable talking about nutrition because they're not nutritional scientists, and you got to be careful when you say that stuff. However, then there's also the convenience factor. I mean, the fact that you can deliver them to a customer, they can cut them live, all these things. I feel like there's a lot of room to grow when it comes to making just the average Joe out there understand the health benefit of what they can have so easily.
Yeah, I think you can take different approaches with different markets. So in the beginning, I had all these info sheets about vitamins A, E, and K, and protein, and this and that, and probably a lot of that's bullshit information. There's some accurate information on some products, but some of the other information I could tell was inaccurate. Protein claims of sunflower sprouts having 25% protein. I don't think that's the case. Things like that. So at a certain point, I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to make any more health claims really about microgreens. That segment of the population that knows that already, I don't need to tell them that.
Yeah.
They already know that. For the other segment of the population, we're going to call them healthy and fresh, delivered to you hours after harvest and delivered by bike and grown organically and grown within the city. And so there's a whole package that people are drawing from. It's not just healthy food. Because I can go to Booster Juice and get healthy food from a big corporate company. I can go to somewhere else and get healthy, wheatgrass shots, but something that was grown in a somewhat factory setting under lights that's never seen sunlight. And to be honest, tastes like shit. So the idea is trying to present a complete package, which really it's kind of along the same lines as a bottom triple line. You're thinking about all these different things, but there's many things to include within that. So I look at it as a much more holistic approach. Yeah. And that way you're not narrowing on health or organic. You're presenting everything and people can choose the message that speaks to them.
Yeah, I always feel like the marketing language needs to not be so obvious. They always say to try to connect with someone on an emotional level, like fulfilling someone's needs or love, fear, those things. And I think sometimes there's a more simple way to connect with someone, because usually they're only giving you 2 seconds of attention before they decide to move on from your booth or not anyway. So
I'm trying to think. It's been a while since I've done a farmer's market, actually. But it's often like, yeah, do you want to try them out? And if people ask more questions, you answer them. But I just give people a chance to taste them. I don't really put a lot of pressure on them. And one of our approaches, was to really get people to start thinking about them as a salad, as opposed to, microgreens and sprouts come from the sort of garnish perspective. Yeah. High-end restaurants with a single radish sprout on top.
Yeah.
That's great in one way, but in another way, like, what the fuck is that, right? That's not a food, that's a decoration. The idea was to try and present, we want people buying a pound or 2 of sunflower sprouts, and that's their salad. It's not like a little sprinkle of something you put into a salad. So trying to change the language on how we use them. Now that's a bit tricky, because then what you're trying to do is sell high volume, and at a higher volume, your price goes down. Mm-hmm. So we tried, I tried and still try to keep the pricing down, because the other thing is it's verging on an elitist food. I want to grow something that's healthy and organic and all that other bullshit I just talked about, but is also accessible to people. And once again, in Vancouver here, there's a lot of money in Vancouver. People can generally afford it. So we're very lucky within that market. And that was one of the decisions that made it, seem viable. But I don't want it to be perceived as something out of reach. And for a lot of people, it still is. I think pricing right now here is at about $18 a pound, which is probably still below what a lot of other people are pricing it at.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would pay that on a regular basis.
Yeah. Farmers don't really want to hear this, but you can almost apply the same logic as the Tesla. They're putting out a Tesla. It's a high price, and they're doing okay on it. But eventually, there's going to be a lot of Teslas at a much lower price out on the market. As more people, because it is an easy way to get started. If you're trying to get into the farming game, even as the most part-time of part-time jobs, microgreens is really not a bad option.
It's not. And when I think about how I started, for me, it was May, June, July, August, September. It was my summer job that bridged my the academic year. I had flexibility within that, like Tuesdays and Fridays were harvest days, and they were full days. Mondays and Thursdays were sowing days, and they were half days. Saturday, I went 5 years without having a free Saturday in the summer. But I had all these other days where there was just nothing to do. And I think it's a model that can really be really well integrated into other things you do in your life, which makes it easy to transition into. And that's the trick. At what point? And for me, there was a point. I did the summer thing for 4 years, I think. And then it was like, okay, now let's see what happens if we go year round and this becomes my main source of income.
Yeah.
And that's a big leap. One of the things we often talk about within any business, the idea of a barrier to entry. And often it's capital, it's expertise, it's infrastructure, it's space, it's market access. These things are all true. But in food, I've been thinking a lot about this. Food has what I call, and I've been looking for a term, maybe there's a term for this that exists, but it's an absolute market. There's no target age, there's no target demographic, there's no target anything. It's everybody at every point in their life needs food. So you've got a big market there. So a lot of things are kind of taken care of with food, and accessing that market's fairly easy. What I find the biggest barrier is, whether it's going into farming or microgreens or anything, is fear. And that goes back to the conversation we were having about being an employee. and an owner. Like your level of responsibility there and your level of liability there is way different. And there's a big fear I think a lot of people have, and I've seen it and I've experienced it myself because I was scared shitless in the beginning, that keeps people away. So this is one of the things I get into with people a lot is like, let's find the things that you're afraid of. And this is what the training does and the education does. Okay, you know where to get your trays and how to fill them and how to do all, you know, the growing part. What's the next thing you're afraid of? Going into a restaurant and talking to chefs. Okay, let's talk about what that looks like. What's the next thing you're afraid of? You know, having a beautiful display at the market, being confident in your product, you know, passing an inspection. You've just got to find ways to deal with those fears. And that's something you can do proactively. And you don't know what that fear is going to be like. Once again, you don't know what you don't know. But if you're prepared for it, you may not even experience it.
Yeah. And when you're going into a business for yourself, you're signing up to face your fears.
Yes, you are.
You have to decide that you're willing to do that, because let me tell you, ordering the first ever sample for Bootstrap Farmer, I had a lot of fear. The first time we ever got a shipment, I had a lot of fear. When I even considered the thought of doing a podcast, like I get butterflies in my stomach and nerves. I have a couple of potential projects on the horizon, which really they kind of scare me because you know what it implies that needs to happen, but at the same time I know I need to do it. How can you fulfill your potential if you're going to back down from fear?
Well, and one of the things with fear is fear leads to paralysis. And when we don't know what to do, we generally do nothing. And one of my isms, or whatever you call them, is, you know, when you're not sure what to do something anyway. And it took me a long time to get to that. And then I got to a point where I realized, you know, just doing things and not to get too caught up in the doing, but, you know, doing is important. You know, it moves things along. It makes change. It gets things completed. And I learned a really good lesson in this several years ago. So our cash box got stolen right from our site where we're producing. Didn't have a lot of money in it, but it was just gone. Like somebody walked right in basically and took it and walked out right under our noses. Yeah. And I wasn't in that day, but I came in later. I was like, fuck, what happened? What do we do? Do we call the police? And I was just kind of like, oh, that's too bad. It's gone. And then I started thinking to myself, well, wait a minute. Okay, so first of all, what am I upset about? There wasn't a lot of cash in there, but there was a lot of receipts. There was a fob. There was things that were important to us, but of no value to anybody else. And the cash box cost us $30 itself. So I thought, well, okay, if I stole this, what would I do? Well, I would do my best to get rid of it as quick as I could once I had what I wanted out of it. And so I walked from our site, and I first I went off to the left and I looked in some bushes. I thought, yeah, like this is a good place to hide. I'd come in here, grab what I wanted, throw it away. So I looked around there and then I didn't see anything. I came back. I went off to the right. I didn't see anything. And I was like, okay, well, I didn't find it, but I tried. And, so there I know, like it's gone. But as I finished up my day and I started driving home, I drove just a little bit further than I had walked, and I saw this little stairway going up into this sort of hidden area. And I thought, oh, there's a place I would go. So I pulled over and I went up the stairs and I saw this little path along these shrubs, and I walked all the way along them, like 50 meters. Then I walked back looking in them, and then boom, lo and behold, there's our cash box. And it's sitting there, and I open it up, and as I expect, everything's in there except for the money. And so basically the person got the money. They left the cash box because number one, they don't need it. Number two, if they're seen carrying it around, they've implicated themselves. And three, the other stuff inside wasn't valuable to anybody but them. That was a real lesson because I learned I did something. I just did that little bit more, which took very little effort. And that saved me the hassle of replacing those receipts, that fob, that cash box. It's like I didn't know what to do, but I did something. I went and looked for it. That's a rule I hold fairly strongly, and I try to keep that in mind a lot because that fear causes you to freeze, and when you're doing nothing, nothing is getting done. So that is a big thing to overcome.
Wow, that's an interesting story, and just goes to show like principles apply in all different areas, and there's lessons that can be taken, even if that happened outside of business. It's like you can learn something from that.
And I actually learned that from watching other people. Because I do watch other people all the time. As a parent, I'm often watching other parents to look for new strategies. And a few people that I know quite well, I would watch them on the phone in a difficult situation where I would have given up. They would keep persisting and they would ask the question and then they'd ask another question. They'd go back to that first question and they almost always got where they wanted to go. They got the information they needed. They got the refund they needed. And so I keep that in mind a lot. And I notice when I'm not doing it. I'm on the phone to somebody. It's like, I'm letting this go. I'm clearly not pursuing it. I maybe could, but sometimes you just don't have the energy for it. But when I really need something or I really need something done, I know I can make that happen if I keep going and keep going. And if I can't, then it probably can't be done. And so it's nice to know where that point is and that I've been able to build up the skill to try and get there. And a lot of that comes from overcoming fear.
And that's self-awareness. It's being very aware of who you are now, who you want to be, what the situation is, being critical with yourself, a little bit.
Absolutely.
I do want to talk a little bit about a microgreens business.
All right, we can do that.
Let's get back to that just a little bit. Let's say you started growing at a hobby level. You've been testing it out in your basement. You went to a chef for the first time. They like it. Your one wire rack is starting to run out of space. And you're committed to growing microgreens. Two things. What system could you recommend to sort of set yourself up with that can scale as you grow? And what other complementary businesses can you start alongside, like growing specialty herbs for those same chefs that you're giving microgreens to?
Yeah, those are some good questions, and this is something I actually talk about in my workshops, because you need what people often don't do is design their business for success. They design their business in a bedroom or in a basement, and they fill up the basement with shelves, and that's it. And then they fill up those shelves, and they're kind of screwed because they can't expand. So you have to plan for expansion. One of the things is space. Can you grow within the space you have? And if you can't, do you have your next space in mind? This comes up a lot because people are like, oh, I've got this space here. I can put up a couple shelves. And then I say, well, do the numbers on that space. Think about the impact on your family of running a microgreens business from your living room. Mm-hmm. And that generally puts the usual male consultee, it's a bit of a reality check. Like, yeah, I can't do that. Yeah. So you need to think about your space and how you can expand your space, and then designing your infrastructure so it can be replicated. The wire shelves you see, like they're a standard shelf. You buy them at Home Depot. You can order them online. You build one, you just put another one right beside it. It's a really easy system. Once you set it up once, it takes half as long to set it up the second time. Mm-hmm. You know the shelves, you know the spacing, same thing. You need the lights, you need everything else. You already know where to source that stuff, so you're just duplicating that same system. Same thing with in my first years, I grew in just the outdoor benches. They were basically greenhouse benches. And I designed them so you just add another section onto them. And I could add a section in 2 hours. So within 2 hours, I could expand my production by, I think it was like 32 trays. And so as long as there's the space to put it there, the key message there is building your business for success. So the other thing is the type of space. Well, we can kind of think of things in the sort of startup phase and then the operational phase. More, especially now, because there's more people entering the microgreens realm, it's more on the radar. Small scale microgreens, we at the Food Peddlers get inspected by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. We went many years without that, but once you're on the radar, you're on the radar. All these things we need to do in terms of testing and recording and monitoring, all this stuff, like we have no choice. I really push people implementing that stuff from the beginning. So when it comes on, when an inspector comes to a small business, they expect you to not have things in order. And when you're already ahead of the game and you're doing things that a bigger business would do, they back off real quick. They're like, oh yeah, you've got your logs here. You've got your standard operating procedures. You've got everything listed here. This is great. Here's these things you need to deal with, but this is great. Good job. So you've got to think about how you're going to grow your operations. If you start with X number of trays, and then you're doubling or tripling that, does your system still work? By developing a more elaborate system in the beginning, it's a bit too much work for 10 trays, but it's the appropriate amount of work for 100 or 200 trays. So you're front loading a lot of the work. So if you have success, you just, we'll just expand. We'll order more trays. Soil will be here tomorrow. People can work more hours. The biggest challenge in this is a lot of people start this business at home. And the reality is that can't grow. When you get into microgreens, it varies by jurisdiction, but you're growing a food product and it needs to be done within what we'll call a quote unquote appropriate space. And then the question I ask is, what would the health inspector say if they came here? So one winter, because I had nothing else to do, it was before we were doing a year-round operation, I grew microgreens in my living room right here behind me. It was great. I made $700 a week just doing what I was already doing. My clientele was already established in the summer. But if the local health authority said, we had a complaint, we need to come look at your setup, I'd be like, I'm done. You can't do that. And it's going to be a little more flexible in some areas and in some rural areas, but in general, you need a designated space for your operation. If you're not able to grow into that, either find a new space, retrofit a garage, build a greenhouse in your yard, use someone else's space, what you're doing is you're building a business that can't grow. And so that's really, really crucial to know that you've got a business plan for a bona fide business, not a glorified hobby. And that's a big challenge. I think a lot of people get to a certain point and they're like, I can't grow and I'm too scared to take the leap, or it's not financially viable where I am. Yeah. So I'm just done. Because if your business has to grow and you don't let it grow, you kind of implode.
That's a really good point. You got to be able to scale up front, like be able to have scale in mind up front. Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, that's really, really crucial. You've got to build your business for success. Otherwise, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah. Okay. Now let's touch on that. Two questions. They're such huge questions. You can only get one at a time. But how would you maybe build other product lines off of microgreens? What things would you consider?
Two things. I would first recommend building microgreens off another product line. I started a standalone microgreens business. My first year, I just sold sunflower shoots. That's it. That was pretty risky, but because there was nobody in the market, there was enough interest that people, and I have a market that has people that will try new things. That was viable. Microgreens is a great add-on to an already existing farm business. Set up, you can grow year round. You can definitely grow in the shoulder seasons when you don't have enough for your CSA. If you're doing deliveries to restaurants already, you can add microgreens to that. There's so many advantages to doing that. So I would say ideally you build it on to something that exists already. Now, if you want to build on to a microgreens business and add something to it, I think there's a few different approaches you can take. One of them is, you can do training and workshops. So you're using your skills to teach others. There you might be, promoting grow microgreens in your home. We'll train you. We'll even provide you with the setup. You can do that sort of thing. You get into, as we kind of touched on, the nutritional stuff. You maybe work with a chef or a nutritionist to do some meal planning around microgreens. You can do things like that. Or you go in another direction, but you use the brand and the reputation that you've developed to bring in a new product line. With the Food Peddlers in Vancouver has a fairly recognized brand. They're the people to go to for microgreens. We're cycling around all the time. This is year 9 or 10 of the business, so it's established. And so if you have another skill set or another product potential, all you have to do is put that Food Peddlers logo on it, and you've got that sort of branded, well-established. Yep. That brand will allow you to access your well-established market. So I'm actually pushing the Food Peddlers crew now to go into coffee roasting, because one of them is super into roasting his own coffee. Yeah. And I said, buy a little roaster, invest some money, and just roast the day before the market. You can take pre-orders, do this, do that, and people are going to buy it because it's from the Food Peddlers, and it has to be good. But because the Food Peddlers already have that reputation for producing a good product, they're probably going to try this new product. Yeah. We talked about that with doing it with crackers, with other things like that. So complementary things. And then the next thing would be looking at the food truck. Can you build a product line that has microgreens as a primary ingredient in all your products, or a good range of them. Yep. And so those would be the sort of evolutions. And once again, it's just a matter of capacity, both mental, emotional, financial, spatial, things like that.
Yeah. It's kind of cool to see where you're at, 9-10 years into it, where you're starting to build what I would call, or have heard called, maybe a community of businesses. You're diversifying your original product into different products. And that's sort of the same goal that I have. I didn't maybe realize it as plainly before. A book I had started reading is Anarchist Guide to Building a Great Business. It was recommended to me, and it's really cool because this guy up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, he owns the Zingerman's Bakery, the Zingerman's Deli, the Zingerman Dessert Shop, and he's building all these businesses which sort of are all synergistic. And I'm just thinking about my own business, and I'm definitely doing that. And I can look a couple of years ahead and see myself really diversifying what I initially started with, because it's just like having one client, that's one client away from being out of business.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just part of the evolution, right?
Yeah, and like in the example you just gave there, they're very similar businesses. They're all going to have the same sort of workflow, and so you're just replicating your model with new products. Mm-hmm. And coffee was one I've looked at. Insects is another. Mm-hmm. Right? What we're trying to do here with the model, this model is based on a number of things, and so in order to keep to that sort of principle, you need to think about the products that are going to be complementary. Yeah. So we're an urban farm with limited space that is trying to do basically grow on or produce on demand product. So there's a lot of stuff that you can add to that really people will attach themselves to, I think.
Yeah. Well, we're just at about an hour now. I think we're about to wind it down. I just want to mention the Farm Small, Farm Smart podcast, which you were on maybe at least 2 episodes. There was one called Growing Great Microgreens Starts with Great Soil. And in that one, there's a lot of good tips on how to grow microgreens. And so if anyone was hoping there'd be a little more of that content, I really have to recommend that episode. I think you nailed it. I wrote notes down. I sent it to my guys here. I appreciate the information you're putting out. I think you might be the first guest that we ever had on that was had some sort of online thing to sell. And I'll just say, I paid $75 for your thing because I thought it was useful, and I think it's a smart thing to get if you're really considering scaling up your microgreens business and you don't feel confident building one yourself. It's one of those things where it's like, if you're not willing to invest in yourself a little bit, you probably shouldn't do it. And so I just wanted to put that disclaimer out there. There's definitely no affiliate stuff going on here. I just thought this guy, he's putting out information because he understands all of the pain and suffering you can go through and the mental stress you add to yourself when you don't have a little bit of a guide and a little bit of a game plan. So just want to say I appreciate the time, appreciate you putting that stuff out there. And is there anything that you'd like to leave us with? Any parting words, or how can people find you? All that stuff.
Well, people can find me at urbanmicro.ca, and I definitely, I'm happy to say I have things to sell. Yeah, I think, what we touched on here, and the thing I try to leave people with a lot, because most of my consults end up being more like counseling sessions. We're really focused on productivity and efficiency and yield and all these things. These are part of the modern paradigm. That stuff is important, but it cannot come at the expense of, the classic one is the environment, but it also can't come at the expense of your social life, your sanity, your relationships. I really push people to think about, if they're going to go into this venture, be ready to work hard and do that stuff. You're going to have to make some sacrifice for a short amount of time. But if the job ends up being sacrifice all the time, either it's not right for you, or it's the wrong time, or maybe you're just not very good at it. It's not for you. It needs to turn from a struggle into, hard enough work, but at least enjoyable and manageable within a couple of years. Or you should try something else. Your own business shouldn't be a source of constant stress like that.
Yeah, you gotta keep trying until it matches what you feel like you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah,
I really agree with that. Yeah, cool. All right, well, thanks, Chris, and hopefully we'll have you back again sometime, and we'll kind of dive deep into some new subject on microgreens. So thanks.
Yeah, and I'm happy to do this again for sure. Yeah.
Oh, cool. All right, I'll leave it there. Hey, this is Brandon Yals from Bootstrap Farmer. Just want to thank you for listening to the podcast. We're doing this podcast because we feel like there's information that we want to get out there that's going to help us all have better farm businesses. So if there's any feedback you have, please let us know. If you're enjoying this podcast, the best way you can let us know that we're doing a good job is to leave a review on iTunes. First of all, that helps us get on the rankings and get noticed by other farmers. And it just tells us that you appreciate what we're doing, and we can continue to add more content that's going to help everybody out. Please enjoy the music by Random Rad.